Belshazzar was never an ideologue or an idealist in any particular camp. He was not ever a pure Marxist or a socialist, or he really was a chameleon. They called him a Wakaman, and in Suriname, somebody who was raised on the streets, who was more interested in power and looking out for himself, and kind of he was really good at reading the rooms and kind of seeing the weaknesses and playing different groups of people for his strategic benefit and to keep himself in power. But at this time, he had a couple different dances with Cuba and Nicaragua. There was a lot of revolutionary fervor that was going on at the time, because a lot of countries were gaining their independence and they were looking at different models for how they were going to run things. So you had countries that historically had been colonial superpowers that had ran them, with foreign businesses and foreign interest in their countries. And as soon as the people got back control, well, the first thing that they voted for democratically was to benefit themselves. They were like, okay, we're going to take our land, our resources, our mineral rights, everything that we have, and we're going to use it for infrastructure and healthcare and build houses and literacy programs. This is what happened. There was a big movement in Grenada where a guy named Maurice Bishop took over, and he was doing that with his New Jewel movement. And this Maurice Bishop was a huge inspiration for Belshazzar, right? He wanted to kind of model Suriname a little bit after what Grenada was doing. So this whole process was happening, and the Americans viewed this leftward drift as a big risk, because Ronald Reagan he's a former actor, right? He was a cowboy. He wore the white hat in the movies. He saw the world through black and white lenses. There's black hats and white hats, and there's no room for you to have flirtation with Marxist ideas, or you're a communist if you're looking at anything in that world, and according to his mind. And so he saw the Suriname having diplomatic relations with Cuba and Nicaragua and other places as a sign that they were losing them to the Soviet Union, and pretty soon it would be a missile base that could attack America right from that northeast shoulder of Suriname, or South America. So this faction within Belshazzar's military council aligned with Cuba. That guy that we talked about earlier, Badrisan Sital was his name, and he had met with Fidel Castro in Managua to celebrate the kind of the national liberation of Nicaragua at the time. And that didn't sit well. And so a pivotal moment came in May of 1981 when Belshazzar issued a formal socialist manifesto. So according to Dutch intelligence agent Peter van Haperen, who we'll get to later, he's a very controversial figure in this story. But he said, and this has been confirmed by other sources, that Belshazzar had and his advisor made a secretive trip to visit with Fidel in Cuba. So by June, Havana had established an official mission in Paramaribo. Now this alarmed Washington to no end. So by September of 1981, Dewey Claridge, who is the chief of the CIA's Latin American division, and he becomes a Iran-Contra figure himself, he debriefed the director of Central Intelligence on Suriname. So by early 1982, coup planning was underway. The formal Suriname-Cuba diplomatic agreement had happened a couple months earlier in November 1981, and that cemented the U.S. fears. And then when Belshazzar forced out President Chinna Sen, which is a name you're going to want to remember because he's going to come up here over and over again in the next few years or next few episodes. When he forced him out in February of 1982, allegedly over his disagreement with the Cuba thing, preparations accelerated. So the blueprint became NSDD-17. It was signed in January 14th of 1982, and it authorized military training for, quote, indigenous units and leaders, and, quote, public information operations and contingency plans against all Cuban forces and under the banner of supporting democratic movements. And in English, they're funding local mercenaries and resistance movements. They are doing psyops and other types of disinformation and propaganda against the local population to get them to turn against the people that the West and America didn't want in power, in this case Belshazzar. and they were supporting democratic movements, which is like resistance movements that had the name like, Democracy for Suriname. We'll talk about the specifics about that in a little bit, but you get the idea. So by October of 1982, when Reagan signed NSD 61, the one that's still classified, all signs point that they were going to intervene in Suriname. They had apparently acquired weapons through NATO depots that they had broken into and stole weapons from. Coup training was allegedly being provided not only through Peter Van Happeren, who we talked about being controversial, but he said he was trained by a guy named Bob Denard. Look him up. That dude has got a crazy story. Took over his own island before being ousted and then retaking it back. So they were planning this thing that I've started to call Operation Red Christmas in December of 1981. And I call it that because they planned a similar thing in Christmas of 1981. Sorry, they were planning it in Suriname in December of 1982, but they had planned something similar in Nicaragua the previous year, December of 1981. They actually, you can read the declassified documents. I've written about this in the archives back on Substack. They went in and they were running terror operations on the Mosquito Coast, where the Mosquito Indian people were living at the time, to try to kind of rally their support. So they were doing exactly the blueprint of what they washed, rinsed, and repeated here in Suriname the following year in 1982. But the problem is that Bouterse caught wind of it. They caught wind of it. Some people, allegedly, according to Van Happeren, were worried about the potential loss. 800 to 1,200 people were potentially going to get killed in this coup. And he said that they leaked the plans to Bouterse. Now, that was only one of the ways that they leaked it. We'll cover more of that in another chapter. But Bouterse executed 15 prominent citizens. We're talking, he kidnapped them in the middle of the night, took them from their beds, dragged them from their children, and brought them down to Fort Zeelandia, which is a moated, stone brick fortress down on the banks of the Suriname River, right on the coast near the ocean there. And he executed them at this little place called the Bermuda Triangle, claiming that they were part of a USA-backed plot. Now, whether Bouterse acted on legitimate intelligence or he used the specter of foreign intervention as a pretext for eliminating his opposition, we don't know. We know what it looks like. The December murders, either way, became a national trauma. It's like their JFK assassination. And it was a pivotal moment in U.S. Cold War operations. Now, near the end of his presidency, Reagan declared that during his 8 years, not 1 inch had fallen to the communists. And he mentioned success stories like Grenada, which, by the way, the blueprint for the invasion of Grenada came out of the blueprint for the invasion of Suriname. And I've also discussed this back in the archives. You can look up the sources on that. So, but Reagan remained very quiet. In fact, he remained silent on Suriname. And there was a reason he had to keep that a secret. And that's because his covert operations in 1982, leading up to the December murders, had helped lead to the deaths of 15 prominent Surinamese citizens. And what was worse, Reagan had been protecting their killer through a proxy of Brazil, which we'll talk to about in the coming episodes as well. So his Suriname incidents don't just represent like a historical footnote. They're really an inflection point in the Cold War where defensive continuity planning, dealing with a potential nuclear attack, evolve into offensive covert operations, going on the attack, on the offensive against anybody the Reagan administration deemed to be communist, and that they didn't want to have to get permission from Congress to be able to get rid of them. They could use this as cover. They could classify the materials. They could raise their own money through drug deals and missile trades and other things that would allow them to self-fund their operations without oversight and go in and bring the jackals and overthrow regimes. And they did this over and over again. So What began as a stranded aircraft on a tropical runway ended as this template for shadow warfare, repeatedly deployed over and over again during the Reagan administration. And in Paramaribo, Project Democracy found both its kind of testing grounds, if you will, and its tragic first casualty. The blueprint that was drafted in those early days would soon be implemented with devastating consequences. So for me, as a child living next door to Baltazar, I couldn't have known any of this stuff, right? But decades later, after piecing together declassified documents and testimony from people that were there, and the connections between my childhood backyard and America's covert operations have become disturbingly clear. So in next chapter or week, we're going to cover the Wolves of Suriname, specifically how Reagan's Project Democracy stocked the pond in the American embassy in Paramaribo with people who were designed to destabilize Suriname using recruitment of Bouterse's right-hand man, using labor unions, using the press to put pressure on him, and then simultaneously to set the stage for what would be an invasion on Christmas Day in 1982. So tune in next time. More on that story to come.